Hey, my name is Luke. I have the privilege of being part of the teaching team here at Momentum, and just on behalf of our team, our staff, just want to thank you so much for making the choice to join us today. In just a second, we're going to be continuing in a series that we call Reads and Wicks. But before we get there, I just want to kind of share with you a Christmas offering that we have going right now, share some of the details and just kind of an update on how that's going. So a couple weeks ago, we announced this, and within our staff, we kind of had a hope that we could raise $50,000 over this Christmas season to give towards just some kind of above and beyond opportunities. One of those was the Care Cottage down in Monroe County. We wanted to partner with that ministry financially down there. We wanted to partner also with the Dream Center here in Henry County. See if there were ways that we could give financially to help them out in what they're doing. At the same time, we also like to partner with our county social workers, so we wanted to give towards them also. And then lastly, down in our Forsyth campus, as we are kind of steadily outgrowing our space there, put some money towards the purchase of land so that we could hope to build something in the future. So we set this goal, $50,000, hoping that God would just kind of surprise us with generosity. And he did. Within the first week, we had one family come to us and go, hey, we want to give 50. Let's start into the next 50. And so we were kind of blown away by that generosity immediately. In fact, to this point now, we have actually had $74,000 given towards these opportunities, which is truly just overwhelming. Like, the generosity of God through his people can be such an encouragement. And so we've been going, how else can we partner in and around our community to serve? And so one of the things that we're looking into is we have a partner in Woodland Camps. They've been looking to raise money over this Christmas season for new mattresses at their camp. So we're looking to give towards that. We're looking for some things that we can potentially do around our McDonough campus, just a number of things that maybe this generosity could help meet needs of. And so I just want to thank you for being a part of that. If you have, if you're curious, if you would be compelled to give cheerfully in that way, not out of compulsion, but just compulsion, but because you want to be a part of it, you can definitely go to the giving information that we talked about earlier. And when you go to give, there's a little category that says Christmas offering, and you can choose that and give there. So anyway, just wanted to give you an update on that. As a personal update, just kind of want to celebrate. This coming Friday, my wife, Katie, finishes grad school. It has been a long season, but we're excited to see what God is going to do next. In fact, right now, Katie is looking into different jobs that she could potentially step in to begin counseling immediately and also start building her hours towards licensure. So that being said, it means that she's had to dust off the old resume. Now, this has reminded me in the midst of this, as she's kind of building out her resume for sharing with local counseling centers, like, resumes are just kind of a weird thing. Obviously on resumes, you'll include education and you'll include like maybe personal giftings, passions, whatever it might be. But you basically make a list of all the places you've worked and hope that that's impressive enough to get you a place at your next stop, to get you a job in the future. The fact of the matter is, as weird as resumes can be, if you think about them, they're very important in our culture. In our culture today, a resume, basically, a good one is basically the equivalent of legitimacy for you. If you've got a good resume, you will be seen as legitimate in the eyes of potential people hiring, in the eyes of others. So it felt kind of fun and fitting for me to kind of share my life resume real fast. It's been a fun road. When I was in elementary school, the first time I ever earned any kind of money, aside from raking leaves, was I was a babysitter for a while. And I know you're going, someone entrusted their children to you, elementary school version of Luke. Yes, I was great with kids. I was actually a pretty reliable babysitter. In fact, one time, I couldn't have been older than 6th grade because we were still living in Macon at the time. I babysat a 3-year-old and the 3-year-old's twin newborn siblings. So like 3 kids, 3 and under, and 6th grade at the oldest, Luke, had it and nailed it. So I was a babysitter. My first real job, well, you guessed it, it was at Chick-fil-A. I I didn't really get to work the counter very much because I guess I'm not eye candy, but they did put me in the back to cook chicken. So I did that pretty well. I did that for a season at the Oglethorpe Mall in Savannah, Georgia, at which point I moved on to work at a place called Autoplex, which sounds like a disease that a car could get, but it's actually, it was a store that was a gas station and a convenience store and a U-Haul dealership, and then also they worked on cars. And so when I wasn't working the counter, I was in the back, and the mechanics oftentimes would put me in cars, raise the cars up, and I just had to push the brakes as they bled the brakes out. And I was basically a human machine for them while working at Autoplex. After that, when I got to my college years, one of my jobs was I worked at Finish Line, which is funny now, but I wasn't a very good shoe salesman. I actually was so bad at it because they wanted me to upsell people, like, here's some socks and some cleaners and some other stuff, and I hated that I just like found my way into the back and I just worked to the stock room all the time. And I loved it because I got to organize things and make it all pretty back there. Anyway, Finish Line. So after Finish Line, I go off to school at Tacoma Falls College, and I got a job there as I worked in the gym. I was a gym monitor, and I was a referee for intramural sports. And so that was kind of the next thing on my resume. After that, between my junior and senior year, I did an internship with a student ministry up in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I started getting ministry experience at that point. While I was there, though, I had my second round with Chick-fil-A, because I didn't make a lot of money as an intern, and I needed to save up for an engagement ring. So I worked at Chick-fil-A also. After I got married, my first job as a married man was another summer internship working with the student ministry. And then after that, I worked for a year at a place called Shepherd's Hill Farm. It was a residential home for at-risk youth. I was a counselor and a mentor and sometimes a disciplinarian. And it was a great year of life learning alongside the students there. After that, I moved to the Loganville, Grayson area of Georgia, and I became a student pastor at Anchor Church for 7.5 years. I was in student ministry until we moved here to McDonough and started on as residents here at Momentum. During that time, I also worked at a place called Blueprint, where I did, you guessed it, Google pay-per-click advertising until I actually received a job offer from Momentum and started working here. So there it is. There's my job history. There's my resume. So if I was actually pulling all that together, and I'm not looking to put a resume out there, if I was pulling it all together, I'd probably be picky. I probably wouldn't mention Finish Line. I'd probably aim towards ministry things because that is kind of the direction that God has called my life. So in Jesus's culture, and that feels like a harsh switch. In Jesus's culture, their resumes, the things that gave them legitimacy, wasn't their work experience, it was their family tree. It was their genealogy. That is where they found their legitimacy. So, just for fun real fast, knowing that fact, I want you to think of your family tree, the people in your genealogy, think of them right now, and imagine them as a resume. Imagine those grandparents and the crazy uncle and all the things. Like, imagine your family tree was a resume. So would you be picky about what you put on your resume? Like, would you kind of leave some of them out? No one needs to know about Uncle so-and-so. No one needs to know about them. Like, imagine your family tree was a resume. How would you present that? See, because family trees were so important in Jesus' day, it's not surprising that Matthew, because we've been following his gospel account of Jesus' life, it's not surprising that Matthew chose to start with a genealogy. However, what is surprising is that Matthew was in no way, shape, or form picky about the people that he put in there. He included some names that, man, if this was a resume, you should have left those names out. But if you were here with us last week, as Bart was kind of teaching through this might not be a surprise. Again, we're in a series called Reeds and Wicks, and the idea behind this is that there was a certain legalistic religious reality that Jesus stepped into, one that excluded a lot of people and was really just for the cream of the crop, the best of the best. And Jesus stepped in and instead introduced grace. In fact, one of the quotes that we had last week from Bart was, Jesus came to set right what religion had gotten wrong about God. We believe that's really one of the pushes that Matthew made as he was writing his book. Because here's the reality, God's law, what we see play out in the Old Testament, God's law, it was beautiful. It is beautiful. But also when you read, it's exclusive. Not many people could live up to it. In fact, what we see the reality of is only one person ever truly lived up to the law, and that was Jesus. And so one of the threads that works its way throughout Matthew's book is that God's love included those that God's law had excluded. God's law was so hard to live by. So aren't we grateful that his love included those who had been excluded? All right, that brings us back to Jesus' genealogy. And we're going to briefly look at it today. And there's kind of a lens through which I want you to see this study. And it's this. To best understand who Jesus came for, you need to know who Jesus came from. To know who he came for, it's really helpful to know who he came from. So the next 2 weeks, we're going to focus on Jesus' genealogy. Next week, we're going to focus on the men, but today, we're going to focus on the women. We're going to focus on the mothers, the grandmothers. And let me just go ahead and prepare you, just as almost a disclaimer. These mothers, these grandmothers that we're going to look at today aren't the G-rated version that your grandmother is. There's some heavy stuff present in this genealogy. What these women did, and actually, maybe better said, what was often done to these women might have been stories that probably should have been omitted. Yet here they are telling their story and pointing towards the person of Jesus. All right, so let's read. We're going to start in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, right off the bat, we have two really big names that we're going to get to next week, but these are basically the framework for Jesus' genealogy. First, Abraham, the father of their faith, and then David, the man after God's own heart. Verse 2, Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Okay, so far, so good. There's already a lot of complication present in just mentioning these names, but for the most part, there's much to admire through each of these characters presented so far. And then we get to verse 3, just even the first part. And Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. All right, we're going to pause there. And if there's a way to cue cringing, it should have just happened. There is immediately cringes that should have come out of this family tree so far. So let's talk a little bit about Tamar. If you wanted to see her story, and I would just say, I'm going to say some stuff about her life that you're not going to believe is actually there in Scripture. If you wanted to find out more about her, go to Genesis chapter 38, because there's a lot. So Tamar, she marries one of Judah's son, His name's just okay? Now, it briefly says, did things that did not please God, and he died. So, Tamar is now a widow. Now, according to their law and customs of the day, if a woman was widowed, her husband's, her now deceased husband's brothers had a duty to give her future descendants, to give her heirs. So it was the job of a brother-in-law to, I'm just going to stay there, to give her sons and daughters. And so that duty then moved on to Er's brother, Onan. Onan the barbarian is what I want to call him, but it moves on to him first. And so Onan sleeps with Tamar, but here's what happens. He doesn't finish the drill. So he doesn't do that, and that goes against the law and the customs, and it is displeasing to God, and Onan also dies as a result of his disobedience. And so now you've got Judah with his two oldest sons who are now dead, and he is very hesitant to give his third son, who I think you pronounce his name Shelah, he was very hesitant to give his next son to Tamar. And so what he does is he sends her off back to her family and just says, hey, we're going to wait a little while. When he's a little bit older, we'll fulfill this. Which is honestly sending her back into shame and poverty, because she wasn't going to have provision there. Her provision would have come through not only a husband, but then also through offspring. And so Tamar is really in a dire situation. So what she does is she concocts a plan where she dresses up as a prostitute and puts herself in Judah, her father-in-law's path. So he comes across her, doesn't recognize who she is, and she seduces him, and he is going to employ her services, but the going rate for said services was a goat. I'm telling you, you have to go read this. I'm not lying about any of this. He didn't have a goat on him, so he instead gives a ring and a staff and a little like sash that went with it as kind of like a, hey, I'm going to give you this. You can hold on to this, and then I will pay you the goat later. So he employs her services, and then he leaves to go get a goat. But she just leaves with his stuff. So when he comes back, she's not there. So very soon after, it's found out that Tamar is pregnant. And Judah finds out about it, and he is livid that she has done this thing. So he goes to kind of figure out what to do next, at which point she sends all of his stuff, his ring, his staff, kind of the sash thing that went with it, and says, hey, the father of my child is the owner of these things. And he's like, zoinks. So he does not know what to do, and instead gives blessing instead of the curse that I guess was coming. And so this is how Tamar is able to continue on her family line. She actually is found to be pregnant with twins. So Matthew, by including these characters in the story, is saying, when you think of Jesus, I want you to think of these people. Now, fortunately, when you look at their story, that created redemption for Tamar, according to their customs, and it also was actually, when you see, it was a turning point in Judah's life. But these are people who are part of Jesus' story. And it doesn't stop there. When you skip ahead just a little bit, in verse 5, it says, and Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. Let's stop right there. We've got another character, Rahab. If you wanted to find out more about her, you could go to Joshua chapter 2. But what Tamar pretended to be in a moment, Rahab had fully embraced as a lifestyle. She was a prostitute. Now, she lived in Jericho and was not a Jewish part of the tribe of Israel. And so she had actually only heard of God, didn't have a relationship with him, didn't follow after him, but had heard of his mighty works and actually greatly feared the Lord. Just knew that God was going to come in and overcome their city. And so she had heard about this, and when two spies of Israel found their way into the walls of Jericho and found their way to her business, they ended up talking through the plans, and she ended up, when it was found out that two spies were in Jericho, she hid them and then helped them to escape. But her agreement in the midst of it was, if I help you to escape, will you spare me when you destroy the city? And they agreed. So when, a few days later, the city was destroyed, they marched around and destroyed the city of Jericho, only her and her family were spared. To be honest, it means that she was a traitor to her people, which isn't like a shining endorsement of her, but nonetheless, Rahab, this prostitute, was spared by God and allowed into God's people. So Matthew is saying, when you think of Jesus, I want you to think of Rahab. We keep going on, even in the same verse. And Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. Ruth we're a little bit more familiar with because she is one of the books of the Bible. But Ruth was a foreigner. In fact, all three of the women that I've mentioned so far were all foreigners to the people of Israel, which in and of itself is its own quandary because they were told by God not to consort with those outside of their people. But here we have Ruth. She is a foreigner. In fact, she is a Moabite. Now, the Moabites came from a person named Moab, which isn't surprising. Moab was a son conceived by Lot. Maybe we've heard of him before, and Lot's oldest daughter. she had gotten him inebriated and seduced him, and that's how Moab came about. So the Moabite people, you work your way down through history, you come to Ruth. Ruth had married one of the sons of Naomi, who was a Jewish woman. So she had married one of the sons. Another woman named Orpah had married the other son, but both of the sons died. So all of a sudden you've got Naomi, who doesn't have a husband or sons anymore, and you've got Ruth and you've got Orpah, and Naomi's like, hey, we're all destined for destitution at this point. Orpah, if you can go home, Ruth, if you can go home to your families and get something out of this, please feel free. You're released, go. Orpah left. Ruth said, no, wherever you go, Naomi, I'm with you. I've got your back. You are my person. I will be your people. And so Ruth sticks with her, in fact, goes to Judah and finds herself in basically one of the worst positions you could be in that time, a widow foreigner. Like, she had no one looking out for her, but God ends up working in ways in her life that she works her way into Jesus' lineage. So Matthew is saying, when you think of Jesus, I want you to think of this Moabite woman named Ruth. When you read a little bit more, just kind of pick up in the same verse. And Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David, the king. And David was the father of Salmon by the wife of Uriah. All right, here is where we get to the person that is Bathsheba. If you wanted to read more about her, you could go to 2 Samuel 11. Here's the thing. She's not mentioned by name here, and that's not a slight of her. That's a slap in the face of David. Matthew is being very pointed in writing that this is another man's wife. Now, we'll get to the men next week. We'll talk a little bit about David then, so we'll come to that later. But for now, I want to consider the story of Bathsheba. Now, in terms of a positive, it seems like she actually is not a foreigner. She's part of the Jewish people. So that would have at least been a positive in this genealogy that Jesus has. But here's the thing. There's a lot of negatives associated with this story. I don't think sometimes we realize the depth of what happens to Bathsheba here. But she's basically forced into a non-consensual relationship with the king of Israel. David forces himself upon her, sees her bathing, says, I want her, brings her into his home, sleeps with her, and she becomes pregnant. Then Bathsheba is forced into kind of a plot by David to try to bring home her husband, that he would sleep with her, and therefore the pregnancy could come across as his. So I guess she was going to be forced to hide this whole truth from him. When it doesn't happen, because Uriah was a noble man, instead, her husband is murdered by King David, sent off into battle, and all the other soldiers pulled back, and he was killed. So that's Bathsheba. And Matthew says, when you think of Jesus, I want you to think of her. So the question is, Matthew, as he's writing this genealogy and he's including all of these people, he's not just hitting the highlights and skipping over them, but mentioning each of these people by name, or at least referring to them. The question you've got to ask is, what are we supposed to learn from this? Why would he include these? What does that say for us? And I think one of the big truths that we see in Jesus' genealogies when we look at his mothers and his grandmothers and so forth is that no matter who you are, what you've done, or what's been done to you, there is a place for you in God's story of grace. No matter how it's played out, no matter what you've had to endure along the way, there is a place for you in God's story of grace. Another way of saying that is this: our disgrace is overwhelmed by God's grace. Whatever we have done that we're ashamed of, whatever has been done to us that we struggle with and we struggle with insecurity and shame about, whatever it might be, our disgrace is overwhelmed by God's grace. So I would say, just having looked at the plights of these women who are the ancestors of Jesus, I don't know what it is that you might be carrying right now, what you might be walking through right now. But I think one of the first steps that we can take towards health, towards recovery, towards overcoming these things so that they don't define us, but they're part of our story, but they don't say who we are. One of the first steps towards health is just understanding the arms wide open grace of God. That when he is writing his story, like that your story is not a disqualifier. In fact, you're welcomed in. His arms are wide open and his grace is for you. Our disgrace is overwhelmed by God's grace. Because here's the thing, you see, with Jesus, we can read our stories differently. The stories that I've just shared with you are tragic. It seems like there would be nothing good that would come out of those things. Like Ruth is the closest to good of all of them, and her life was so difficult. It seems like nothing good could happen, but with Jesus, we can read our stories differently. When you see him as the finish line and all of this being part of God's work of redemption, you can find hope and even joy in the midst of the difficulty that these women endured. So when I look at my life, my testimony is that Jesus has not only turned my sin, but also the tragedies of my life, he's turned them upside down. Things that should have held me down, things that should have disqualified me, things that should have been just a source of great grief, God has used them to produce joy in my life. How has he done that for you? Maybe you're in the midst of the grief right now. How might God be working your story into his greater story of joy and redemption and salvation? See, because when we look at Rahab, here's the thing. We see this Old Testament story of her, but when you get to the New Testament, both the writer of Hebrews and James in writing his letter praised Rahab. They pointed to her faith and celebrated her. I mean, when you look at Ruth, like Ruth is a non-Jewish person who gets her own book in the Jewish Bible. That's crazy. And yet that is how God chose to write their stories into his. These women get to be seen not only for their humanity, but also for their value in the midst of Jesus' story. And see what we see happening centuries later. Well, we can read it in Matthew chapter 1, verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. So centuries later, after these other women that we've just looked at, a pregnant, supposedly a virgin, Mary, would be embraced by her immediate family despite the apparent scandal in her life, and that through her, Jesus would come to be with us. This woman who had no business being the source for all of humanity of Christ the Lord is nonetheless the one who delivers him into our midst. So today, as we're considering Jesus' genealogy and what it says about him, I want us to look at the stories of these women and to be reminded and encouraged of this basic truth that we see today. To best understand who Jesus came for, you need to know who Jesus came from. When you look at them, you can know that he came for you and he came for me. Let's pray. Father, God, I thank you for this day. Lord, I thank you that your family tree, that your resume isn't some squeaky clean, out of reach thing, because we would all then end up striving for that and never quite reach it. But instead, we see the brokenness and the depravity that you came from, and we're reminded that even in the midst of our own failures, our own grief that we've caused for ourselves, the grief that's been caused by others in our life, even in the midst of all of that, we have great hope and great joy because we get to be a part of your story. That we're not limited by the things that have happened to us, but Lord, instead, we see how you want to work in and through us. So God, we celebrate that today. I thank you for these women. I thank you for Tamar. I thank you for Rahab. I thank you for Ruth and Bathsheba, Lord. I hate that those realities happen to them, Lord, but I'm so grateful that they're a part of your story. I'm so glad that you have chosen to use even those who have been marginalized and abused, that your salvation might come into this world. Lord, I pray that you would use us